Well, welcome back, critical thinkers. And now for our last topic under sort of the big heading of psychological processes that can interfere with your ability to make a good rational decision. And really, it's an extension of our discussion from last time, where we were talking about compliance and the weapons of compliance, and how sometimes someone is intentionally trying to get you to change your behavior or your beliefs. And if you do that, that's compliance. And a special type of compliance is called obedience. And this is where we have this natural tendency to comply with people who are in authority, with authority figures, people in power. And so make sure you have the lecture entitled Obedience. It's got Cartman from South Park on there open so that we can talk about it, right? All right, so let's talk about obedience and how it fundamentally can interfere with our ability to make good critical thinking based decisions. And much like cognitive dissonance and much like conformity and much like compliance, this is just a basic psychological tendency we all have. It doesn't make us bad. It doesn't make us immoral. It just makes us human. And there are a lot of situations where obedience is a good thing. Right? When a professor asks you to do a particular project or to complete a quiz, and you do it, that's obedience. You're complying with their request, and that's to help you, and that's a good thing, right? Or when children obey the reasonable requests of their parents, that's obedience, and that's a good thing. Where it breaks down is when we sort of automatically, unconsciously, and uncritically sort of give in to the pressure of authority, where it can be a bad thing, much as an automatic, uncritical caving to conformity or compliance can be a bad thing, right? Because let me give you an example. Now, this is a real example. It actually comes from sort of political science history or the history of the United States. And just from the get-go, I want to make clear that as we discuss these various examples of sort of problematic power, I'm not criticizing the military. I'm not criticizing police officers. We're going to talk about nurses, and I'm in no way criticizing nurses, right? I'm just giving you these examples for you to sort of wrap your mind around and recognize that even the most well-intentioned people, even the people who are the most highly trained, can fall into sort of making bad decisions because of bad requests made by authority. So here's an example from the 80s, and it's a real example. In 1987, a man named S. Brian Wilson, who is actually a veteran, and two other men were protesting the United States involvement with sort of rebel forces in Central America. Not only were we involved in Nicaragua, we were also involved in El Salvador and Guatemala as well. But he was specifically protesting the current shipments that the U.S. was making to Nicaragua, rebel groups in Nicaragua. They were sending weapons to Nicaragua, and he just disagreed with this decision. If you're more interested in sort of the political climate at that time, you can do some reading on what's called the Iran-Contra affair, and sort of the USA and its involvement in Central America during the 80s, and draw your own conclusions about the political ramifications. That's sort of separate from our current discussion. Our current discussion is really about what these men decided to do. Mr. Wilson and two other men informed the Navy, who was in charge of sending these weapons to Central America, informed them 3 days in advance that they were going to be protesting. This was a staged protest. This was something they were doing to make a statement. And they let the Navy know they were going to be doing it to sort of bring attention to the issue. And so they let them know that they were going to be laying across the railroad tracks in an effort to sort of bring attention to the U.S.'s involvement. And they really believed that the train wouldn't hit them, that the train would stop and they would make their statement. But that's not what happened. That's actually not what happened. What happened was the day came, and the officials told the train operators to run them over, right? And that's exactly what they did. The train operators ran over Mr. Wilson, and it's not like they could definitely see them, right? This was a wide railroad track. They did in fact intentionally run over Mr. Wilson when they were told to by the authorities. And Mr. Wilson didn't actually blame the people who ran the train. What he did was he blamed the system, right? He blamed the authority figures who sort of trained these civilians. They were civilians, by the way. The train operators to run them over. And so this is an example of possibly the problematic listening to authority, right? Going along with what an authority figure tells you to do, even if you think it's wrong. So moving on to slide 3. So what is authority then? So authority is absolutely a weapon of compliance, right? We have this natural tendency, this automatic evolutionary tendency to listen to people and authority figures. That's why it's used in advertising, right? 4 out of 5 dentists recommend, 9 out of doctors prefer, because we have this natural tendency. And so an obedience then, slide 4, is when we in fact listen to authority figures, right? When we listen to authority figures and do as they ask us to do. When we change our opinions, we change our behavior because someone else wants us to. That is obedience, right? That is obedience. And so, but I don't want you to take my word for it, right? When I tell you that there's this automatic tendency that we have to listen to authority figures, I want to provide you with some evidence for that fact. And the first study I want to share with you really establishes how primal our tendency to listen to authority figures is. It's an evolved trait, and it can be a very good thing in some situations, and like when children listen to their parents, keeps them safe. But it can break down. But first, let's sort of look at the evidence that suggests that it is an evolved trait. And so we look to research with other non-human primates, right? Which reveals that you don't need society to teach people to listen to authority figures. It's really an evolved trait that we have as primates, that we exist in hierarchies as primates, and we have this natural tendency to look to the people above us as a guide for our behavior. And so what they did in the early 70s is they did a bunch of different studies with monkeys, and monkeys being primates, you can split them in most monkey sort of troops. You can split them into what are called central monkeys or high status monkeys, leader monkeys, versus what are called outsider or peripheral or low status monkeys. You've got these sort of two groups of monkeys, high status monkeys and low status monkeys. This is how the monkeys see themselves, where sort of the peripheral monkeys keep to the outside of the group. They don't have they're not central to the group. And here's what they did. They gave in one series of studies, they gave basically caramels, wonderful, delicious, intrinsically wonderful caramel to low status monkeys. They gave delicious caramels to what are called peripheral or low status monkeys. And a year and a half later, only about 50% of the monkey troop were eating these naturally wonderful, delicious caramels, because clearly caramels were low status monkey food. And so the leaders didn't want to eat the caramels, despite the fact that the caramels were delicious and the monkeys would intrinsically, naturally find the caramels delicious. The leaders of the monkey troop were like, nope, clearly low status monkey food. I don't want to eat the caramels. Even a year and a half later, only about 50% of the monkeys were eating them. In a different series of studies with a different set of monkeys, what they did is they gave bread, sort of wheat bread, to the leaders of the monkey troops. And 4 hours later, everyone's eating the bread. Now, bread is nutritious, right? But it's not intrinsically delicious like a caramel, right? Like if you gave like one monkey a caramel and bread, that monkey's going to choose the caramel every time. intrinsically delicious, all that butter and fat and sugar. Primates just love butter and fat, right? And so here we really see the pull of authority, right? That if caramels are coded as low status monkey food, nobody eats them, even if they're wonderful and delicious. If bread is coded as high status monkey food, everybody starts eating the bread, even though it's not especially delicious. This really suggests sort of the evolved nature of authority and how we as primates really look to those in charge as a guide for our behavior, right? It's primal. It's in slide 6. And this has real-world consequences, right? Real-world consequences. And we can look to research on medical errors. And in the 1970s and 80s, there were lots of studies that looked at sort of the efficacy of sort of medicine in the U.S. And these studies continue, but there was a big push in the 70s and 80s to sort of look at medicine and sort of look at what was happening in medicine in the United States. And what they found at that time, in the early 80s, was that the daily error rate, which is about 12%, at the time, 12% of this 12% error rate, most of the errors that are made in hospitals are because of unthinking, uncritical obedience to what doctors have told nurses and other staff to do. It's not that people are making legitimate mistakes, but that rather there's a communication breakdown. A doctor says to do something, and you may be and you're a nurse, and you maybe misunderstand what the doctor has said to do, but you execute it anyway, because if any of you have ever worked in a hospital, doctors are the final authority, right? You do what the doctors tell you to do, and even if it seems like a mistake, or even if it seems wrong, it's a perilous thing to question a doctor. I mean, you can get reprimanded or in trouble as a nurse or other staff person if you question a doctor's orders. And nurses are some of the most highly trained, intelligent individuals. Becoming a registered nurse is difficult. There are really hard tests you have to do and really, really arduous training. But even given how highly trained nurses are, it's difficult. It's in the culture of a hospital where doctors are the final authority. The doctors are in charge to push back and say, hey, doctor, I think you may be making a mistake. And so oftentimes nurses will just learn to unthinkingly question the orders that are given to them by the doctors. For example, in this 1981 study, one of the errors that they found was actually a nurse who had administered eardrops rectally, go out the back, in the back door, right? Rectally is your rectum, which is where you defecate, where you go to the bathroom, right? And they had administered these eardrops rectally because the prescription had been written in kind of a messy fashion, and she had read it as rear as opposed to our ear, right ear. And so this sort of unthinking culture of obedience to the doctor's orders causes these errors and continues to cause errors today, right? There are more checks and balances in hospitals today where there are more ways to identify mistakes before they get made. But the culture of obedience in hospitals to doctor's orders is still very much present. And so, again, moving on to slide 7, we focused on sort of an example where this can be a problem, right, in the hospitals. But the pull of authority isn't a bad thing, right? It's functional. It's a functional thing. We are highly motivated, right, to make sense of our world. You remember one of those motives, accuracy? We're motivated to make sense of our world, and authority is functional. It increases our ability to have smooth social interactions, and really without it, society would break down, right? So authority is not a bad thing. We have police officers and professors and senators and and scientific authorities. We have all of these authorities in our society, and they're not bad, right? We listen to authority figures because authority figures often have good information and often will be telling us to do things that will in fact help us. The only problem is what authorities tell us to do is not always good. And so we always need to critically evaluate the kind of information authority figures give us. And the second problem is not all people who say they're authorities are actually authorities. So let's sort of explore some cases where authority can break down and cause problems. All right. So, titles. Titles certainly convey authority, right? Slide 8. Like, for example, I have a doctor in front of my name, right? Trust me, I'm a doctor, right? It says it right on my shirt. Trust me, I'm a doctor, right? I am. But I always have to warn people I'm not that kind of doctor, right? I'm not that kind of doctor. I can't help you. Even though I'm a psychologist, I'm not even that kind of psychologist. I cannot help you. I don't know what's wrong with your life. I'm not a clinician. I'm a research psychologist. I literally cannot help you with your problems at all. I'm not a helper. Right? But that word doctor in front of my name often leads people to give me more authority in different situations than I actually have. And lots of people can fake titles. For example, there was a book written, I believe in the 90s, called Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. And it was written by a man named, I believe, John Gray. And his PhD, giving him a doctor in front of his name, by the way, not an MD. Nope, not an MD, not that kind of doctor. He was not a clinical psychologist, right? So he does not have a PhD in clinical psychology. He got his PhD from an unaccredited institution that's what's called a diploma mill, right? Not based on anything real. Anybody can sort of slap a title on their name and fake authority, right? So you just have to be careful, right? And also remember that titles, whether they're fake or not, influence how we view things, right? Remember that study that that showed that people who were labeled as a professor were seen as taller, right? Right, a half an inch taller for every increase in labeling, right? Student, demonstrator, lecturer, senior lecturer, professor, right? And if you guess how tall I am, I'm betting most of you, if you saw me in person, would guess that I was taller than I am. And most people do. Most people guess that I'm taller than I am because I have this title in front of my name. And so remember, titles can be faked, right? This even works, so just remember that you should question someone's title, right? Question someone's title because it's going to be influencing how you view them. Here's another example, slide 9, of how you can basically fake authority, right? So what they did in the 1960s is they did a research project trying to determine how safe hospitals were. And what they did was they called 22 different hospitals, the researchers, right? And the researchers had contacted the administrators at the hospitals to get permission to run this study. And what they did was they said, they called 22 different hospitals and they called the nursing stations, again, staffed by highly trained, highly intelligent registered nurses. And they said that they were a hospital physician. And they ordered the nurse over the phone to give 20 milligrams of a particular drug that was in the drug cabinet. And so the question then becomes, what happened, right? This is a fake person calling, a fake person. So what happened? Well, here are some reasons why the nurses, moving on to slide 10, here are some reasons why the nurses should not have given the drug. First of all, prescriptions are not supposed to be given over the phone. Anybody who's worked in the medical field knows that. The medication the doctors had called and said to use was not actually cleared for use. It hadn't been cleared by the FDA. The dose, 20 milligrams, was twice the daily maximum allowable dosage and said so right on the package. And the name of the doctor that called in on the phone, this fake doctor, was not a name the nurses would have been familiar with. It's not like they were pretending to be a doctor the nurses knew. They just gave a random name. Hi, I'm Dr. Nobody. I want you to grab this uncleared medical medicine and give twice the daily allowable dose to this particular patient down the hall. These are some really big reasons why you should not follow these orders, right? And yet, 21 out of 22 of these nurses got the medicine out of the cabinet, walked down the hall and had to be stopped by the researchers so they wouldn't give the drug to the patient. Now, is that because these nurses were stupid? Of course not. These nurses were highly trained. It was this automatic tendency to listen to the doctor's orders, because that's the culture in hospitals, and it sort of reinforces our natural tendencies to listen to authority figures. And that's what happened in this case. Slide 11. And there's just so many ways that we can sort of fake authority, or that where authority can be faked, where we would then listen to the person, like clothes, right? Someone in a police uniform, someone in an army uniform, someone in priest uniforms often will have a large sense of authority invested in them just based on the clothes that they're wearing. There was a comedy movie out the last year or so that was like Let's Be Cops, where they had costumes on and everyone treated them as if they were authority figures because they were dressed as policemen, and they just sort of ran with it. But those are just so easy to fake, right? And for example, here was a study that was done in the 70s where what they did is they had the same young man, like 20 years old, the same young man either wear jeans and a t-shirt or be dressed as a security guard. Not even a police officer, just a security guard, right? And what he did is they had this young man stand on a street corner. And then he would tell people walking by, hey, you should feed that guy's meter over there. The time is out. And then he walked away. And so the question then becomes, did the person comply? So we've got an independent variable. Was he wearing jeans and a t-shirt, or was this young man wearing a security guard uniform, right? That's the independent variable. And then the dependent variable is whether or not the person, having heard him say, hey, you should give him a dime because his meter ran out, whether or not the person complied, whether or not they obeyed. And what they found was 92% of people, when he was wearing a security guard uniform, fished into their pocket, grabbed a dime, and gave it to them. Whoa. And only 42% of the people, when he was in jeans and a t-shirt, gave the dime, right? And this was true when they redid the study with a female, right? A female in a security guard uniform had very similar compliance rates, right? So these fake clothes were like a signal to do as you're told, right? Just a signal, do as you're told. There's a reason why security companies often will dress their security guards in as police, because similar uniforms to police officers, because it sort of confers that authority, and people are much more likely to listen. So slide 13. I like this one because it just sort of shows how many different types of clothing confer authority. For example, like a business suit will often confer a sense of authority. And so they did a very similar research study to the guy in the security guard uniform. They had, again, a young man either in a suit and tie, like a three-piece suit, versus that same young man in in jeans and a t-shirt. And then what they did is they had this guy cross at the light where it said no crossing, so jaywalking, right? So we've got the independent variable. Half of the people are watching a man in a suit jaywalk, and the other half of the people are watching a man in jeans and a t-shirt jaywalk. And the question then becomes, dependent variable, how many people followed suit and followed the man jaywalking? Did they cross at the light? And what they found was, if a man in his business suit jaywalks, people are 3.5 times more likely to jaywalk also than if they see someone in jeans and a t-shirt, right? It's these signals of authority, right? Uniforms and business suits, they confer a sense of authority that we then listen to in this very unconscious, automatic way. And so at this point, now that I've hopefully convinced you that authority is totally a thing, and we have this automatic, natural tendency to listen to authority figures, and after I warn you that not all authority is bad, that listening to authority can be a good thing, I do want to now share with you something called the Stanley Milgram studies on obedience. Because even though listening to authority figures is natural and it can be a really good thing, like when children listen to their parents, if we don't critically evaluate and carefully evaluate the requests that authority figures make to us and don't decide for ourselves carefully that we want to listen to what the authority figures ask us to do, this can really, really lead to some negative outcomes for people. And so what I want you to do now is I want you to watch, at this point, now go watch the hour-long Milgram videos that really sort of illustrates what happened when Stanley Milgram did research on obedience. And just as a little background, Stanley Milgram decided to see to what extent people would obey somebody giving them commands that were immoral, like unethical, immoral commands. Could he get people to do something unethical if he gave them the right sort of prompts in terms of authority? And this is also the paper I asked you to read, the same paper, the Stanley Milgram experiment paper, where and it's our last forum activity where you're supposed to have read the paper. So hopefully you've already read it, and hopefully you've wrapped your mind around the studies, having read the paper. But now I actually want you to watch the videos to sort of get a sense of the visceral experience of these participants and what Stanley Milgram sort of was able to get them to do. You should also be aware that that nobody was actually harmed, right? The study was fake. Nobody was actually harmed in these videos. So, but they're still very painful to watch, right? They're sort of distressing as you watch them. Because it sort of really makes you question sort of the human nature and our ability to to empathize. But also keep in mind some questions. So on slide 14, there's some questions I want you to think about. Does conformity play a role here, right? Informational social influence. Does the need to understand? Does normative social influence play a role, right? The need to fit in. Does that play a role? And also, the last thing I want you to think about as you're watching it is, do these participants seem like they don't care, right? Or do they really seem to care a lot, and they're really concerned about the other participant, but obey anyway, right? I want you to ask yourself these questions as you watch this video. And then after you watch the video, come back and we'll continue this discussion. All right. So, we back? Have you watched the Stanley Milgram video? Well, hopefully yes, right? Because otherwise our next discussion is not going to make a whole lot of sense, right? So, just to sort of remind you what they found, 60% of all of his participants went all the way to 450 volts, all the way to the end. Past when the guy was pounding on the wall, past when the guy said, my heart, all the way to the end. They kept obeying and kept obeying and kept obeying all the way to the end. And everybody, 100% of participants, go until after the gentleman has talked about the fact that he's in pain, right? Everybody goes to into the hundreds of volts, right? Into the hundreds of volts range where the gentleman makes it clear that he's in pain. So everybody obeys. Everybody obeys and does something unethical. And 60% of people keep obeying even after they make it clear this man might be dead. I mean, that is just a shocking thing, right? That's a shocking thing. And having read the paper, hopefully you recognize that this was not unique to this time, right? That they did follow-up experiments and this was not something unique about being in the 50s, right? This is something deep within us. What was going on here? Were these bad people? Is everyone just evil? Well, no, right? They wanted to understand the situation, right? Informational social influence. They wanted to make sure they were doing the right thing. They didn't want to be the odd person out. They didn't want to not fit in, right? Especially in the follow-up studies where there was multiple people in the room, right? But the biggest reason why all of these participants obeyed is simply authority. The man in the white lab coat with the clipboard, who is a professor and a doctor and a scientist who works at Yale University, is telling you that you must continue. And it becomes colossally difficult to say no under those circumstances. And so everyone continues for quite a while, and then 60% of people keep going all the way to the end. Now, 40% of the people stop, right? Because this was a very extreme situation that they had put these people in. And 40% of the people were able to sort of overcome their natural tendency to obey and stop the study. But that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. And the 60% of participants who kept going aren't bad people, right? They're just doing what's natural, listening to the authority figure who says that the responsibility is on them. And I think it's important as critical thinkers then that we recognize all the situations we find ourselves in where an authority figure asks us to do something, and it becomes imperative for us to say, okay, this person is asking me to do something. They're in authority. Is what they're asking me to do ethical? Is what they're asking me to do moral by my own code? Can I do it? Right? Should I do it? Because our tendency, and then yes or no, right? And there are consequences when you disobey authority, and maybe those consequences are salient for you, and you say, well, even though I don't want to do this, if I don't do it, I'll have very negative consequences, and I'm not hurting anybody by doing this, so I'm going to go ahead and do it, right? And maybe that's a good choice. But as a tool in your toolbox, as a critical thinker, I just want to illustrate for you how important it is to not automatically listen to authority figures, to reflect, to stop, to think, and go, okay, weighing all the different things against each other, what should I be doing in this situation, right? So if you're asked to do something unethical where you're hurting somebody, I would hope that that you would say no, as I hope I would if I was put into this tough situation. Right, and so on slide 17, you really get a graph of the results, right? Over 60% of people, 65% of people go all the way to 450 volts, right? And everyone goes into the hundreds of volts, which just sort of really illustrates how powerful authority is. But I also want to talk about some of the, I want to disentangle some of the things that made this situation so incredibly powerful. How this situation was uniquely like a perfect storm of obedience, right? Because what Milgram did was a bunch of follow-up experiments, right? To see whether or not he could increase obedience or decrease obedience, right? And here are some of the things that he found, just some of them, when he redid this experiment in 1974. So he had two Confederates disobey, right? He had two other people in the room who said, nope, I'm not going to shock this man. Obedience rates fell dramatically. Obedience rates fell from 65% all the way to under 10%, right? If the real participant was required to take the participant's hand and actually put it on a shock plate in order to shock them, obedience rates fell to 30%. If the real participant was required to look at the participant in the face as they were shocking them, obedience rates fell to 40%. If the experimenter left the room and just gave the commands over a loudspeaker, so wasn't standing there with his white lab coat and the clipboard, without reminding the person of all those trappings of authority, obedience rates fell. If the person running the study introduced themselves as just a research assistant with no actual authority, obedience rates fell. When they redid the study at an office location, meaning not at Yale, which is a highly prestigious university, obedience rates fell. And when there were no commands given, right? When the same script was read and the real participant was simply told, for every wrong answer, shock the person, right? Same instructions, but the researcher then doesn't say anything, right? Just leaves. And so then the teacher has to decide for themselves. Almost nobody keeps shocking, right? A teeny tiny, small percentage of people keep going. So what was going on here in the original experiments that led to this 65% total obedience rate in both men and women? It's at being at Yale University, having a man there in a white lab coat with a clipboard who introduces himself as an expert, who introduces himself as a professor and a scientist, but also having the learner in the other room where you can't see their face, so they're somewhat dehumanized, right? And then the incremental nature of it, 15 volts, then 30 volts, then 45, became a perfect storm of obedience, leading people to engage in very unethical behavior because of the pull of authority, right? So moving on to slide 19, there was the authority of the setting, the lack of proximity, meaning the experimenter wasn't in the same room as the learner. Those things mattered a lot, right? Slide 20. When the learner and the researcher switch scripts, right? When the researcher says it's time to stop and the learner says, no, you can keep shocking me. I don't care. Even though I have a heart condition, you can keep shocking me. Everybody stops. 100% of people stop and say, no, I'm not going to shock you. The researcher says I can't shock you, right? So it's really about the authority figure, right? Then they also had the researcher and the learner switch roles. They had the researcher say he had a heart condition and he was going to be the learner. And when the researcher was being the learner also and said, hey, I have a heart condition, stop, again, everybody stops. It's this authority that we listen to in this very automatic way. Slide 21. A couple of other things that they varied. Which sort of helps us sort of wrap our head around what was so influential here. In one follow-up study, they had two researchers contradict each other, meaning one researcher says you got to stop, and the other researcher says you got to go on. And what the people end up doing is looking back and forth between the two researchers to figure out who's really in charge, right? So it's like we just have this automatic tendency to listen to the person in charge, even when that person in charge is telling us to do something unethical, right? And so it's just, we have this deep-seated, I don't know if you call it a need, but this deep-needed tendency to listen to authority figures, which is a good thing if you're listening to your parents, if you're a child and you're listening to your professor, if you want to get a good grade. It's a bad thing if some researcher is telling you to harm an innocent participant, right? And that was sort of, I think, Milgram's point, is that you don't have to be an evil person to commit an evil act, right? You don't have to be a bad person to fall into one of these situations that can lead to bad behavior. And a good critical thinker then can recognize these situations when you stumble into them, and then hopefully will be less likely to follow bad orders should you ever be given unethical and immoral orders. So slide 22. What I actually really like about one of the follow-up studies that they did is where they actually where Milgram showed the intersection between conformity and obedience, where he had a Confederate in the room who said, no, I'm not going to keep shocking this person. And what was beautiful to me in this follow-up study is that when a non-authority person, someone who wasn't in authority, said, no, I'm not going to follow this unethical, immoral order, when I'm not going to shock this person, obedience rates fell to 10%. So conformity can be used for good, right? So not only is conformity not always bad, it can be a good thing, because when a Confederate refused, then almost everyone also refused and said, no, I'm not going to keep shocking this gentleman. Of course, conformity can work against you too, because what they did is they had another Confederate who continued, who went, okay, no problem, I'll keep shocking the gentleman. And then obedience rates spiked to 93%. And I just want you to imagine how many situations we find ourselves in that are like this, like work settings, right? Where maybe a boss tells you to do something immoral, or a boss tells you to do something unethical, and you see all of your coworkers then also engaging in this unethical behavior. It becomes incredibly difficult from a deep psychological perspective to push back against that and still make a good decision yourself, right? Also, recognize that these obedience situations also captured cognitive dissonance as well. The incremental nature of the shocks were small and gradual, and that also led to the increased likelihood of obedience, right? So these Milgram experiments were, which you can think of many real life situations where this might come up, not only had conformity and compliance and cognitive dissonance, but then also obedience pressures led people to engage in some very bad behavior. And Milgram was really sort of looking at this as a good psychological explanation for why war atrocities happen, how Nazi Germany occurs, right? Where the government starts with something small, like saying this group of people can't come here, and then they move up and say, well, these group of people can't shop here, or this, and then it's small, it's incremental, right? Cognitive dissonance pressures, foot in the door technique, right? And then everyone starts to do it. So you have conformity pressures, and then obedience pressures sort of take hold, and whole nations can start engaging in sort of horrific crimes against humanity because of our natural tendencies to conform and comply and obey. All right, the last video I want you to watch, I think, is sort of the end cap to my whole point, that psychological processes can interfere with our ability to make a good, rational decision, is actually is a different experiment that was conducted in the 60s called the Stanford prison experiment. And this is, yes, it illustrates the role of authority, absolutely, but it also illustrates the role that social scripts play, that situations themselves can betray us and interfere with our ability to make good, rational, critical thinking based decisions. And so the Stanford prison experiment was very controversial. It still is controversial. It was a sort of an experiment that took on a life of its own as it was occurring. And it really does illustrate how authority can become really problematic, but also, as I said, just the situation itself. And I think that's the final message I want to lead you with, that the situations you find yourself in, these strong, powerful situations you find yourself in, can sometimes lead you to make bad decisions and to automatically start making bad decisions. And a good critical thinker stops and reflects and goes, what am I doing here? Right? So that if you find yourself in a strong situation, you'll remember our discussions and say, wait, am I just listening to conformity? Am I just listening to compliance? Am I listening to obedience? Am I listening to the power of this situation instead of making a good critical decision based on the facts that I know to be true and my beliefs that I know to be true, right? That's what I want to leave you with. So go ahead and watch this video, the Stanford prison experiment, and then come back. All right, so last thing I want to leave you with. As a good critical thinker, you recognize how much social roles can affect you, right? That what was happening in the Stanford prison experiment is informational social influence, right? Conformity. These men saw the other guards engaging in very bad behavior, and so I thought, well, maybe I should be doing this. But also normative social influence. They didn't want to be the only guard not doing what everyone else wants to do, right? You don't want to be the odd man out, but then also authority, right? Zimbardo had gotten caught up in this study. Zimbardo himself had gotten caught up into the authority of the situation, in the power of the situation, and because he was doing it, that became a signal that it was okay for everyone to be doing it. And of course, this was being conducted at Stanford, which is a highly respected institution. And so this became, again, this incredibly powerful situation that led these individuals in an uncritical way to make some very bad decisions, right? And so that ends our discussion of sort of the psychological processes that can really interfere with your ability to make good decisions. And now that you know what those processes are, cognitive dissonance, conformity, compliance, obedience, and just the power of the situation, hopefully you will be less likely to let these pressures influence you negatively, because you will pause and take a minute and go, okay, I'm in this strong situation. I feel the pressure of conformity and obedience. Is this a good decision? And maybe you'll say yes, maybe you'll say no, but hopefully you'll have critically evaluated your choices. All right, thank you very much.